I want to tell you a story based on Acts chapter 12 that I've really just found so relevant this last week in terms of world events and world leaders and things like that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time or any time really explaining what I think the story means, because I think it speaks for itself. But as I've thought about that story and done some research, I was reminded of one of the only parables told in the Old Testament, and how these two stories link up so very well. Now, this is a parable that's found in the book of Judges. I love the book of Judges. It's simultaneously the most amazing book and probably the most disturbing book in the Bible, and it's something you can just really sink your teeth into in terms of the visuals and things like that. But in the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 9, there's this guy called Jotham, who's one of Gideon's sons. Gideon was one of the judges, and Gideon has long since died, and Jotham tells a parable to this group of people who have set up technically the first king of Israel. If we're going to look at it, be technical about it, he wasn't a real king because God hadn't put him there, but he tried to become the first king of Israel. He was a guy called Abimelech. And in order for him to do that, he makes this agreement with the people from a place called Shechem, and they kill all of Gideon's sons. I mean, we're talking like 60 or 70 people here, except for Jotham. And Jotham is standing on a hill, and he sees all of this happening, and he shouts this parable over them. Now, I want you to listen to the parable and think of world events and world leaders, and how it connects to that. And then I'm going to tell you the story from Acts chapter 12, and see if you can see similarities. And this is what Jotham says to Abimelech and the people of Shechem. This is the parable. One day, the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. They said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree answered, "Should I give up my oil, by which both gods and men are honored, to hold sway over the trees?" Next, the trees went to the fig tree. "Come and be our king." But the fig tree replied, "Should I give up my fruit, so good and so sweet, to hold sway over the trees?" The trees then went to the vine. "Come and be our king." And the vine answered, "Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and men, to hold sway over the trees?" Finally, the trees said to the thorn bush, "Come and be our king." And the thorn bush said to the trees, "If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon." That's quite the parable. Certainly a lot to think about. The story from Acts chapter 12. Fear is a powerful force. If used correctly, it can start or stop a rebellion. It can paralyze people into inaction or force them to do something, depending on who's wielding it. Fear is powerful. The city was packed. The countdown to the year's biggest festival had begun. The city officials and the community leaders just wanted this festival to go by without any disruptions, without any troubles, without any violence or anything like that. Anything could have been better than last year's festival. The man in charge, well, no one really liked him. He wasn't the kind of person people liked. He was a despicable person, capable of the most horrific things. But you really couldn't argue with his results. So the community leaders, they backed him. Mainly because he said he would do things for them. Or perhaps he had some dirt on them. But mainly because he said he would go back to the way things were, or take things back to the way they wanted them to be. As the festival grew closer, it appeared that those responsible for the uprising of last year, or part of the uprising from last year, might be planning something. They had managed to increase their numbers exponentially. And so people were worried. So the man in charge took action. He would go after the leadership of the group. He would do something about it. He would discredit them. He would lie about them. And if he needed to, he would get rid of them. At the time, the group was really led by 3 people, by 3 men. He managed to get 2 of the 3 of them. The first was a man called James, the son of Zebedee. And he had James executed. And then he caught the big fish, the one with the loud mouth, the one who was causing the most trouble at this point. He managed to find and catch him, the one that the community leaders hated the most, and they were so pleased that the man in charge had this man. So Peter was imprisoned on the eve of the festival. The man in charge realized that it wouldn't be a good political move to kill Peter during the festival. So he had to wait until afterwards. He had to leave this man in prison. He was concerned about this, the man in charge, because Peter had escaped prison a few times. He'd been in prison and just walked out. No one knew how, no one knew why. It just happened. And so the man in charge was taking no chances. He got 16 soldiers, 16 guards to be with Peter at all times. 16 people in his cell. 24 hours a day. Peter was chained to one on each side of him, and the others would be around. And there would be 2 guards at the door. Even Peter's clothes were taken away from him, just in case he was able to get past the soldiers. If that were to happen, then he'd be naked, just in his undies. Once again, the festival of Passover came. And once again, Jerusalem was on a knife edge. The followers of Jesus were devastated by James's death. And they were devastated by Peter's imprisonment. What would that mean for them? They'd seen God do some pretty amazing things. They had seen God save Peter from prison, help him escape. And so they gathered together in little groups and they prayed. And they prayed with the assurance that the God who had done amazing things for them just months or days before would save Peter. And they prayed all through the Passover festival. They didn't stop. And Peter? Well, Peter made most of the situation. He caught up on his sleep. He told the guards about Jesus and the things that Jesus had done for him. Perhaps they would at this point know the story better than any of the other apostles, because Peter would just not shut up talking about Jesus. The last night of Passover came, and Peter was relaxed. So relaxed that he was fast asleep. His head on one of the shoulders of the soldier next to him, drooling onto his shoulder. Everyone in the cell had fallen asleep. Suddenly there was a bright light. No one knew where it came from. And a messenger walked into the cell. A messenger from God. Was he an angel? Maybe. Was he a man that God had empowered? Maybe. What we do know is that he was a messenger from God. Peter, get up. Peter was sleeping so deeply that he didn't even hear him. Peter, get up. The messenger hit Peter on the head. Peter woke up, but sort of only half. He kind of thought he was dreaming still. The messenger said, get up, take your clothes, put your shoes on, get your coat, let's go. And Peter followed him as if sleepwalking in a dream-like state. He put on his clothes, he put on his shoes, he put on his coat. He got up and his chains fell off his arms. And they walked out past the guards through onto the street. And it's only when they walked just down the road and the wind blew and the messenger disappeared that Peter realized he wasn't actually dreaming. God had helped him escape from prison. And Peter realized that he was exposed. He realized that he was a fugitive. So he made his way to Mary's house. Mary was someone who held church meetings in her house. And he knew that the church, or some of the followers, would be there. So he went to Mary's house. And he was right. Because at Mary's house, there was a group of Christians, followers of Christ, praying for Peter. And he knocked at the door, and they sent Rhoda, a little servant girl, because they were too busy doing the important work of prayer. And he carried on knocking at the door, and Rhoda came to the door, and as was customary, she asked who was at the door, and he said, "It's me, Peter," and he kept knocking. She recognized his voice, and she was so excited that he had been gotten out of prison that she left him standing in the street in front of a locked door. She rushed to the room where people were praying. There was some on the floor, lying prostrate, some on their knees, some sitting, some rocking, some crying, some speaking out loud. "Hey everyone, your prayer's been answered. Peter's at the door." "No, he's not," said someone. "He can't be at the door. He's in prison. Maybe it's someone trying to catch us out." No, he's at the door." "Oh no, maybe it's his guardian angel, or maybe it's some other angel." No, he's at the door." And they kept arguing. But the knocking kept happening. And eventually a whole group of them went down to the door, and they opened the door, and sure enough, there was Peter. And they were absolutely amazed. It's ironic, isn't it? That those who were praying were amazed that God had heard them. Peter told them the story. He told them what had happened. He told them that he felt like it was a dream, but that it clearly wasn't. And then he said to take the message to the other apostles and James, because he didn't know James was dead. And then he went into hiding. He left the place because he was a fugitive. You would think the story would end there. But the story's not just about Peter. The story's also about the man in charge. Because you see, the next morning, he had a spring in his step as he walked down to his throne room. And as he sat down to receive his first message of the day, that spring was broken. What do you mean he's not there? There were 16 guards in that room with him. How can he not be there? Call those guards in. Let's find out what's going on. And so all 16 soldiers were hauled in front of the king, of the man in charge, Herod Agrippa, the grandson of Herod the Great. All the soldiers had the same story. Simple. We don't know. We don't know what happened. And Herod was so incredibly angry that he had every one of them executed right there on the spot. And the church, it continued to grow. Herod did his best to find Peter. And usually that would be the end of the story. But it's not. Because this story is not just about Peter. It's about the man in charge. You see, Herod Agrippa was not someone you should mess with. Had lots of issues with lots of people. There was this group of people from a place called Tyre and Sidon. And they'd really upset him. He didn't like them very much. So much so that he held back on giving them provisions. And they could not survive without these provisions. They didn't like him very much either, but they knew they needed to kiss and make up for whatever they'd done. So they contacted his right-hand man. And they said, please have a word with the man in charge for us. Tell him we'll do anything. We'll even have a festival for him in our town. And we'll have him up on a stage and let him have a speech, and we'll treat him to pomp and ceremony, and we'll make him feel like he is a god. That sounded pretty good to the man in charge, and so he agreed. The day came, he went down to Tyre and Sidon, and the ceremony started, and there was pomp and all sorts of things. There was a red carpet, there was a stage, there was a beautiful chair for the king or for the man in charge to sit on. And he sat and he watched all these people bow to him. And the time came for him to give his speech. And he stood up, holding his coat on him, like kings do. And he walked up to the podium. And as he walked up to the podium, the people really wanted to impress him. So they shouted, "The voice of God, the voice of God, the voice of God, the voice of God." Oh, Herod was so pleased to hear that. It wasn't true of him, but it was amazing to be seen by people like that. So he took the acclaim and he took the glory for himself, and he enjoyed reveling in people telling him this thing about him. The voice of God, the voice of God. God Almighty, the Lord God, had had enough of this. He would let no one else take his glory. And so he sent a messenger to touch Herod Agrippa. And the messenger touched him. And suddenly Herod Agrippa's stomach began to hurt. So much so that he could not finish his speech. He sat down and he writhed in pain. And the coming hours and day or so that happened were really, really terrible for Herod Agrippa. The scriptures say that he died from being eaten on the inside by worms and rotting on the outside. And that was the end of Herod Agrippa. The church that he had tried to stop and silence by killing its leaders and persecute, well, it flourished. They faced persecution in Jerusalem, but in other places like Antioch, they thrived. So much so that the church in Antioch sent 2 men with food supplies for the church in Jerusalem. And they went back to Antioch after they'd helped. Their names were Saul and Barnabas. Later on, Saul would change his name and become Paul. And from that point onwards, Paul and Barnabas went out into the known world and started telling people about Jesus. And that message continues to this day. No one will have God's glory except him.